My wife was cheating on me with a married colleague, so I teamed up with his wife and destroyed their lives. But then, hey Reddit, I'm just a regular guy, a father and husband who thought he had it all figured out. But recently my world turned upside down, and I feel like I'm living someone else's nightmare. I've been married to my wife, Emma, for 9 years. We have 2 beautiful kids, a nice house in a good neighborhood, and by all outward appearances, we're that happy family you see smiling in photos on social media. But something's changed, and I can't ignore it anymore. Our marriage hasn't been the same for the last few months. It's like there's this invisible wall between us. Emma's mood shifted, and she started becoming distant. She used to be the one initiating date nights and family outings, but now she's making excuses to be away from home. Late meetings, weekend getaways with friends, even business trips I never heard about before. You get the idea. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Her job has always been demanding, but this felt different. She's not just tired, she's distracted. And then there's her phone. She used to leave it lying around, but now it's glued to her hand like she's afraid it'll self-destruct if I glance at it. My gut told me something was off, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, Emma and I promised each other honesty and trust. I tried to ignore the doubts creeping in, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the final straw came when I overheard a conversation she had with her sister on the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I walked past her office door and heard her say, "He has no idea. I don't think he ever will." That's when I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. That's where it all started. I just wish I knew how deep this rabbit hole was going to go. So I decided to do some digging, nothing too crazy at first. I casually asked Emma about her plans, tried to see if her stories lined up. But each time, she gave vague answers and brushed off my questions like I was being overbearing. Then one day, she slipped up. She told me she'd be out with her friend Jenna, but later that evening, I ran into Jenna at the grocery store. When I casually mentioned Emma's whereabouts, Jenna looked confused and said, "Oh, I haven't seen Emma in weeks." I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. When I got home that night, I knew I had to get serious. I needed to find out what she was hiding, and fast. The next day, I installed a location-sharing app on Emma's phone. It was risky, but I had to know. That evening, she claimed she was heading to a team dinner downtown. I watched as her location pinged, not to the restaurant district, but to a quiet residential neighborhood on the other side of town. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, hoping it was a mistake. She stayed there for 3 hours before heading back. I couldn't sleep that night, imagining every scenario, every possible excuse she might give. The next morning, I calmly asked how her dinner went. She didn't hesitate. "It was fine, just work stuff," she said with a smile, not missing a beat. That's when I knew she was lying right to my face. I knew I needed more than just her location to confront her, so I decided to take things a step further. That weekend, I told her I was visiting my parents out of town. Instead, I parked a few streets away from the same house I'd seen on the app. Sure enough, Emma's car pulled up about an hour later. She got out, smoothed her dress, and walked up to the front door like she belonged there. A guy stepped out, tall, fit, and probably in his mid-30s. They hugged, and then he leaned in to kiss her, a kiss way too intimate to pass off as friendly. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking. This was it. Solid proof. But instead of feeling relief, I was filled with a sickening mix of anger and sadness. I wasn't just losing my wife. I was losing everything I thought we had. The following days were brutal. Every time I looked at her, I had to bite my tongue to keep from exploding. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I replayed the scene outside that house over and over in my head. How could she look so comfortable with him when she barely looked at me like that anymore? But I still needed to be sure. I needed to know if this was a one-time thing or if there was more to their story. So I hired a private investigator. It felt like a betrayal on my part too, but what choice did I have? The investigator, Carl, was an older guy, calm and professional. He didn't judge or pry, just asked for the basics and got to work. For a week, I barely heard from him, and it was agony waiting. Then, last Thursday, I got the call. "We need to meet," Carl said. My stomach churned. When we sat down in his office, he slid a folder across the table. "I'm sorry, but there's a lot more going on than you probably imagined." Inside were photos, not just from that day I saw them, but from multiple weekends and even a few weekdays. There were timestamps, dates, and locations. Romantic dinners, overnight stays at his place, and even a weekend getaway. They were practically living a double life. And then Carl dropped the real bombshell. I also found out who this guy is. His name's Luke Davis. He's married with a kid. My head spun. This was bigger than I thought. Emma wasn't just cheating. She was tangled up with a married man. Someone else's husband and someone else's father. All I could think about was that poor kid and Luke's wife, who probably had no idea, just like I didn't until now. I spent the next couple of days in a haze, trying to figure out what to do next. Confronting Emma felt like the obvious choice, but I needed more than just anger driving me. I wanted to know why she did this, why she lied so easily, and why she chose him. So I decided to play along. I acted like nothing had changed, like I was the same oblivious husband who trusted her completely. I even started being more affectionate, more attentive, trying to see if she'd respond differently. To my surprise, she seemed almost relieved. She smiled more, even initiated conversations instead of burying herself in her phone like she usually did. Was she actually happy that I wasn't questioning her anymore? I couldn't tell if it was guilt or if she genuinely believed she'd gotten away with it. But I noticed something else. Whenever Luke texted her, she'd get this little smile. Not the warm one she used to give me, but a sly, knowing one. I could see her eyes light up, like she was some love-struck teenager. That's when I made my decision. If she was willing to risk our marriage and family for this guy, I wanted to see if Luke would do the same. So I reached out to his wife. It was nerve-wracking, but I found her on social media and sent a cautious message. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. I think there's something going on between my wife, Emma, and your husband. Could we talk?" I half expected her to ignore it, but she replied within an hour. "Let's meet." My heart pounded as I read her message. This was it. My next move would change everything. We met at a small cafe outside of town, the kind of place where no one knows your name or business. I arrived first and was nervously stirring my coffee when she walked in. She looked composed, maybe a little too calm for what I was about to tell her. I stood up as she approached and introduced herself. "I'm Katie," she said softly, her voice betraying just a hint of unease. I took a deep breath. "I'm Mark. I'm sorry about all this." I gestured to the empty seat across from me, and she sat down slowly, folding her hands on the table. "Tell me what you know," Katie said, straight to the point. I handed her the photos and waited while she flipped through them. Her face remained expressionless, but I noticed her hand start to tremble. When she reached the last photo, one of Emma and Luke at a hotel, arms wrapped around each other, she finally looked up at me, eyes wet. "How long?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "Months, at least. I'm not sure when it started, but..." I hesitated. "They're serious, Katie. He's been sneaking around a lot, weekend trips, even staying overnight at our house when I'm supposedly away." She blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the flood of information. Then she straightened up and gave me a look that sent chills down my spine. They think they're so clever, but they're not the only ones who can play this game. "What do you mean?" I asked, caught off guard. Katie leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Luke and I have been in a rough patch for years. He's made mistakes before, but I let it slide for the sake of our son. But this him risking everything for her." She shook her head slowly. If they want to blow up our families, then fine. But we're not going down without making sure they pay the price. What are you planning? I asked, curiosity and concern mixing uneasily. She smiled for the first time since we met. We're going to show them what happens when you gamble with people's lives. Katie's words left me both uneasy and intrigued. Over the next few days, we kept in touch, carefully planning what to do next. She was adamant about hitting them where it hurt, but in a way that left no room for them to play the victim. We agreed to confront them together. The timing had to be perfect. We picked a date when Luke and Emma were supposed to meet at a hotel out of town, one of their getaways. Katie called Luke right before he was set to leave and told him she was planning a surprise family dinner that night. Meanwhile, I texted Emma that I'd be coming home early, hoping to derail their plans. But they both lied, claiming they had work commitments and promising to make it up to us. It was exactly what we expected. They were too deep into their affair to notice the trap we'd set. Katie and I arrived at the hotel ahead of them and checked into a room with a clear view of the entrance. As we watched, they pulled up together, laughing and holding hands. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, but I held it together. This was just the beginning of our plan. We waited until they checked in and headed up to their room. Then Katie made the call. I watched as she dialed Luke's number, her face a mask of cold determination. He picked up almost immediately. "Hey, honey," Katie said sweetly. "Just wanted to remind you to bring home some of that wine you like tonight. You know, the one you always get after work dinners." There was a pause on his end. I could almost picture him going pale. Yeah, sure. "I'll grab it on the way home," Luke stammered, trying to sound casual. "Oh, don't worry about it," she continued. "I'll be picking it up myself after I finish this conversation with you in front of your girlfriend's husband." Luke fell silent. Katie locked eyes with me and switched the call to speakerphone. "Say hi, Mark." "Hey, Luke," I said evenly, my voice surprisingly steady. "You know, you two really aren't as good at hiding as you think." There was a tense silence, and then Emma's voice came on, shaky and panicked. "Mark, what are you doing there?" "Just enjoying the show, Emma," I replied. "Now, you two should get comfortable. Katie and I are coming up for a little face-to-face chat, and trust me, it's not going to be a pleasant one." We took the elevator up, and with each floor, I could feel my heart pounding harder. Katie, on the other hand, looked perfectly composed. When we reached their room, I knocked lightly, and we heard frantic whispers on the other side. The door creaked open, and there they stood, Emma with a disheveled look of fear, and Luke, pale and wide-eyed, like a deer caught in headlights. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "Don't even try it," I said sharply. "I'm not here to listen to lies." Katie stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Luke. "You two were so busy building your little fantasy world that you didn't realize the destruction you were causing," she said coldly. "We're here to make you see what that feels like." Luke tried to step forward, his hands raised defensively. "Katie, please, let's talk about this." "Talk," she scoffed. "There's nothing to talk about. I've already sent everything, the photos, the messages, to your boss and to your parents. By the time you get home, everyone will know exactly who you are." Emma looked at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "Mark, I'm sorry. I made a mistake, but—" "A mistake?" I interrupted, my voice trembling with anger. "You made months of mistakes, Emma. You ruined our family for this." I gestured at Luke, who looked ready to bolt. "I hope it was worth it, because there's no coming back from this." Their faces turned pale as the weight of what we'd done sank in. Katie and I didn't stay to hear their excuses or see their panic turn to desperation. We left the hotel, side by side, knowing we had one final move left, and it was going to hit them harder than they ever could have imagined. Katie and I drove in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. But I could see the gears turning in her head. She wasn't finished yet. As we pulled into a quiet parking lot, she turned to me, her expression serious. "There's one more thing we need to do," she said. "Luke and Emma think we're just going to blow up their reputations and leave them to pick up the pieces. But they need to understand that this isn't just about us. It's about our families, our kids." I frowned. "What do you have in mind?" She pulled out her phone and showed me an email she'd drafted. It was addressed to Luke and Emma's workplace HR departments, outlining every detail of their affair, with time-stamped evidence to back it up. "Wait, you're going to get them fired?" I asked, taken aback. "They work in the same company," she explained, her voice steady. "It's against company policy for employees to engage in relationships that could affect the work environment. This isn't revenge, Mark. This is accountability." I thought about our kids, the lies, and how Emma and Luke had so casually risked everything. "Do it," I finally said, feeling a strange sense of calm. Katie hit send, and just like that, we dropped the final hammer. Whatever happened next was out of our hands, but one thing was certain. Emma and Luke's perfect little world was about to come crashing down. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, Luke and Emma's phones were blowing up. Katie and I stayed in touch, tracking the chaos from a distance. Both of them were suspended pending an investigation, and the office gossip mill was in full swing. I heard from a mutual friend that Emma's boss was furious, not only because she'd violated policy, but because they'd used company trips for their getaways. But it didn't end there. Katie had one final card to play. She shared Luke's affair with his family and friends, framing it not as a betrayal of her, but of their young son. "Imagine growing up and finding out your dad destroyed your family for an affair," she wrote in the message. "What kind of example is that?" Luke's family rallied around Katie, furious at him for risking their grandson's future. And Emma, her own sister, called me, apologizing for Emma's behavior and offering to help however she could. The walls were closing in on them from every direction. It wasn't just their reputations that crumbled. They were cut off from their social circles, shunned by people they once considered close. Katie and I had made sure that, for once, they felt just as isolated and betrayed as they'd made us feel. In the days that followed, things escalated further than I expected. Luke tried reaching out to Katie, begging her to let him fix things. He showed up at their house unannounced, pleading on the front lawn until she called the police to have him removed. He even sent me a long-winded apology email, blaming stress and claiming he'd made a terrible mistake. I deleted it without responding. Emma, on the other hand, became desperate. She tried calling and texting me constantly, swinging between apologies and accusations. "You're destroying my life," one message read, as if she had forgotten who had truly set this chain of events in motion. But the strangest twist came when Emma showed up at my office, looking disheveled and defeated. "Please, Mark, I've lost everything," she whispered, eyes red and swollen. "Let's just talk. Can't we at least try to work through this for the kids?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone I no longer recognized. "I did everything I could to save our family, Emma," I said quietly. "But you're the one who threw it away." She tried to step closer, but I shook my head and stepped back. "There's no us anymore. You made sure of that." Security escorted her out, and as she left, I felt no satisfaction, no victory, just an overwhelming sense of finality. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. After that incident, Emma seemed to finally accept it was over. She stopped coming around, but I knew she hadn't given up completely. Instead, she tried a different angle, using our kids to get to me. She'd suddenly show up at school pickups or drop-offs, pretending it was for family bonding, all while hinting at how we should try family counseling for their sake. I stayed firm, refusing to engage. I explained the situation as gently as I could to our kids, telling them that Mom and Dad wouldn't be together anymore, but that didn't mean we loved them any less. It broke my heart to see the confusion and sadness on their faces, but it had to be done. They deserved honesty, not more lies. Then, one evening, I received a letter in the mail, not from Emma, but from Luke's wife, Katie. Inside was a simple handwritten note. "Thank you for helping me find my strength. Let's keep moving forward." Attached was a finalized divorce agreement. Luke had lost everything: custody of their son, their house, and even his job. Katie had filed first, ensuring she came out on top legally and financially. Reading that letter, I realized that I had been so caught up in the anger and revenge that I hadn't even considered what came after. But Katie was right. It was time to move on, to build something new out of the ruins. This mess didn't have to define the rest of our lives. A few months passed, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. I finalized my own divorce from Emma, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel like myself again. The bitterness faded, replaced by a sense of calm acceptance. Emma and I kept things civil for the kids' sake, but our interactions were limited to logistical discussions. She moved into a small apartment nearby while I stayed in the house, focusing on giving our children stability. I'd see Emma watching them wistfully during their school events, a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I knew she regretted what she'd done, but some things are simply too broken to fix. One afternoon, as I was picking up my kids from school, I ran into Katie. She looked happier, more at peace. We exchanged small talk, and then she said something that stayed with me. "You know, Mark, it's strange, but losing everything made me realize how much I had been holding on to something that wasn't worth it. Now I finally feel free." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. We'd both been through the worst kind of betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. As we said goodbye, and I watched her walk away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I'd survived, and while Emma and Luke had shattered the lives we knew, they hadn't destroyed us. Katie and I had found our own ways to rebuild. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but it was the one I needed, a chance to start over, not as a victim, but as someone ready to embrace whatever came next.